lean in and wave. Everybody ready? Imagine a mother who can't afford to feed her own newborn, so instead she chooses to breastfeed. However, her breast milk isn't nutritional enough to actually provide enough nutrition for her infant's daily diet. The purpose of the speech today is to show why genetically modified crops can help the food insecure populations in developing countries. Hi, my name is Benjamin Churba, and I'm a food and resource economics major with a specialization in international business. Students like us all the time can experience food insecurity on a daily basis without even realizing it. For example, you can have enough money to go get your food, however, it's not nutritionally rich enough food to actually maintain a balanced diet. As a brief preview of what we're going to be seeing in today's speech, first, what is the problems that are arising in developing countries? Second, why are genetically modified foods necessary to solve for these problems? And third, are these practices with genetically modified technologies actually working? So the first thing we're going to delve into are the problems that are actually occurring in developing countries, which include food insecurity and malnutrition. If you look at the chart right here on my slide, from Our World in Data, it shows that there are two main reasons that have the highest densely populated, the most people with food insecurity, which are Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. It's important to note that these two regions are densely populated with developing countries. According to Kathleen Heffron of the International Journal of Molecular Science, there are 843 million people worldwide, not just in these two regions, that don't have enough food. And 2 billion people are part of the hidden hungry population, which means they're malnourished because they're not getting enough nutrients in their daily diet. When you couple the limited resources in these developing countries, along with the extreme conditions that they're experiencing, it makes farming a difficult task. That's where genetically modified crops can help. Now, genetically modified crops provide solutions for these problems that are occurring in these countries. They can actually limit the resources that are being used and increase the crop yields in the end. According to Martina McLaughlin of the University of California, Davis, 3 of 4 people in developing countries rely on agriculture either directly or indirectly for their livelihoods. This is important when you note that there are 4 main issues that genetically modified crops can help solve in these developing countries. First, it can help with biofuels like ethanol, where corn can be produced genetically and actually decrease the costs of gas. Second, therapeutics, where you could actually inject genetic traits into plant medicines and actually make them more therapeutic for their consumer. Third, nutritional value added benefits. And fourth, it could actually increase yield by increasing the stress resistance experienced in the plant from extreme weather conditions, pests, and insects. Now let's take, for instance, to put this into perspective, a small rice farmer in South Asia. Now this rice farmer needs their crop in order to feed their family and also provide an income for their family. Now let's consider that same farmer is experiencing insects destroying his crop yields. Now this farmer can actually turn to genetically modified crops to find an insect-resistant genetic trait that will increase his crop yield and actually provide enough food to supply his family and enough income to buy more food for his family. Essentially, genetically modified crops are the only way to solve back for this food insecurity problem that is occurring in these developing nations. And these developing countries' farmers are actually seeing great success and efficiency in doing so. Now, when you look to the developing countries, you actually see that these farmers are doing away with the antiquated agricultural techniques like normal farming and tilling, and they're actually wind up going towards these new genetically modified crop technologies, which in the end is efficient and effective for these farmers. According to Graham Brooks of PG Economics, in the past 2 decades, we've seen an increase in crop yields in developing countries, which is actually equated to a more stable food supply for these developing countries and an increase in the income per household in the developing countries. which is important when you actually put this into monetary terms. In the past 2 decades, we've seen an overall net economic benefit of $186.1 billion, 52% of which has actually come from farmers in developing countries. Now, this is important because there's a cycle that actually happens. When these farmers don't have enough money, they can't buy enough foods, which actually leads to malnutrition. Malnutrition leads to disease, which means they can't actually wind up farming even more. So this cycle can now be broken by these genetically modified crops and provide a more stable access to a food supply for their family. Now, in conclusion, we looked at 3 things today in my speech. First, we saw what the problem was that is arising in developing countries, which is malnutrition and food insecurity. Second, we looked as to why genetically modified crops are essential in solving back for these problems, as they could help the biofuel industry with their ethanol, they could help therapeutics by adding genetic traits to plant medicine. Third, they can increase the nutritional value per crop by adding traits such as beta carotene, which can actually absorb more iron within the human body. And fourth, we actually see that it can overall increase yields and decrease the stresses that are actually occurring on the crops with more stress-resistant traits. Now, to put this all into perspective, remember the analogy that I made in the beginning in my introduction. Consider that same mother who before couldn't afford enough food for herself nor her child. Now, genetically modified crops can actually afford this mother the ability to not only feed her child, but provide a stable enough food supply and income to provide for her entire household and herself. Thank you. I hope you learned something today. Have a great day. Now we have 2 minutes allotted for questions and answers. So if you guys have any questions for me, now would be a time.
I'm curious, if you're a farmer in one of these areas, there's going to be a price to plant regular crops. Is there an increased cost for the farmer to plant GMOs versus planting regular things? Like, do they have to invest more?
Sure. So there might be a slight increase in the initial investment to get started for genetically modified crops. However, we see that these farmers in the end will wind up saving money by not having to spray pesticides, not having to spray herbicides or insecticides on their plants. It's because these plants now have genetic traits that can resist all of those without extra sprays or anything toxic.
So as far as these farmers getting a hold of the GMO technology, are you expecting them to modify and go through that whole process themselves, or are you suggesting that these are purchased from a more developed nation, or what?
So this is actually where we see organizations like the United Nations, UNICEF, and the Food and Agricultural Organization coming into play, where they have bases in most of these developing countries or in the regions of the developing countries in order to provide that humanitarian assistance, which is, in this case, providing those genetically modified technologies and then teaching them how to use those genetically modified technologies.
And will GMOs, will they increase crop yields just automatically if used in any area of the world, not just in developing countries?
Right, so yeah, they could increase crop yields around the entire world because they create these genetic traits that make them stress resistant to all these other factors. So not just in developing countries, but it is the best way for developing countries to increase their yields enough to solve for the food insecurity problem.
Are there any downsides to using GMOs?
The downside, I would say, to using a GMO would be potential hazards in the long run. There's not many research studies since it began only in 1996 that span over 40 years or a lifespan for a human. So there could be potential long-term harms, but in the short run, it's the best to solve the food insecurity and malnutrition problem. I think that's all we have for questions.